Welcome, President Klaus. Thank you for speaking with me. I've been reading and seeing your interviews on COVID policy, and it has struck me how different your perspective is than many other European and American politicians. And so what I'd like to do today is I just would like to go back in time to your experience as president of the Czech Republic, handling other pandemics, and then we'll move forward to COVID and talk about that. Okay. So when you were president of the Czech Republic, there were other pandemics that happened. For instance, in 2009, there was the H1N1 flu pandemic.
Yeah.
And I remember I was an academic then and still writing on this. People were quite scared about the how deadly the disease was and how widespread it was likely to be. And yet we didn't see around the world the same level of fear and panic and the kinds of restrictions that we saw now. Could you talk a little bit about how you handled that pandemic, how the Czech Republic handled that pandemic?
Well, I must say that this pandemic was just the marginal issue in this part of the world, and especially of the Czech Republic. As president, I remember just one big debate in the government about buying Tamiflu, if I'm not wrong, was the name of the medicine, and I criticized it and I suggested that it's a nonsense, that it's not necessary. That was the issue of the day. Of course, the government, in spite of my warnings, decided to buy it, and as a result of it, it simply was not used, and then the typical result of crazy panic-driven decisions of the government. Good example.
Yeah, Tamiflu is interesting because there's a lot of evidence that it actually doesn't stop hospitalizations or deaths when the flu happens. So there was a lot of money wasted. I think your intuition was actually quite good back then. Like, what is it about the difference between now and then, though? So, was the availability of a drug like Tamiflu, did it reduce the fear? I mean, maybe it was, even if it wasn't medically necessary, maybe it was worthwhile to address the panic.
Well, I think that this panic and this situation was much better prepared than the first one. You know, the Western society is also not in a better shape than it used to be 10 years ago. Yeah. If you take all the crazy isms which are attacking or have been attacking our society, starting with global warming crazy idea, with migration, mass migration in Europe, with all those, not to speak about Black Lives Matter, and so on. So I think that the society is more vulnerable, and the people are not so in a good shape.
Can we talk? So let's now move forward in time then to the current COVID crisis, and I want to move forward to March of 2020, and we had governments around the world adopt absolutely extraordinary measures, basically quarantining large numbers of healthy people at home, shutting down businesses in the United States and many other places, at least for a short while, in the United States for longer, keeping schools closed. And it struck me that at the time it was politically impossible to resist. That the population at large had an enormous respect for the scientists and other public health people who were arguing for these measures as necessary to control the spread. And that political popularity of those measures actually, I think, continues, maybe less now than at one point, but as we're starting to see some protests. But it struck me as very extraordinary that the free world very readily agreed to these measures. And it's not just, it was imposed from above on a reluctant population. It's actually quite popular, many of these measures. Can you tell me about that? Because that struck me as very strange.
I like your term political popularity. I will use it in my presentations. I speak more often about that COVID has a good PR, which is really something very specific these days. And you mentioned two players. You mentioned public and politicians. I think this is not a full picture. I think this time the role of the so-called experts is really visibly different. It's connected with the so-called liberal democracy, which is, in my understanding, not a full standard classical democracy. And the role of the so-called experts in many fields, but especially in medicine, has become much more important. So I think that the experts have never had such a position in societies all over the world, and this is what makes me nervous. And I see it in my country, I see it in your country, and I see it elsewhere. In Germany, Germany is next door for us, and we follow the situation, the debates there. So I think that at least in our country, the politicians are quite happy to say that it's not our business, we don't understand it fully. The so-called medical experts are experts on everything. Let them decide what to do. I am afraid something very similar happened in your country. I must admit that I totally disagree with this kind of the position of the so-called experts. I'm not a medical doctor, I'm an economist, but I spent a lot of time doing mathematics and statistics and econometrics, so I think I know something about probability and I know something about time series. So I think that I fully understand the models used by some epidemiologists, and I know that they are very trivial and they are playing games with all of us. So I published a lot of articles protesting against that.
I mean, it struck me too, and in what you just said, I saw that same thing, that the power of expertise was much greater than I had ever. I mean, of course, experts are needed, but ultimately, this is not just simply a scientific question. It's a question of values and trade-offs in values, trade-offs between people, and of course, politicians and politics. That is what politics is supposed to be. It's supposed to mediate, consistent with scientific principles, but also the different values, what people care about. So it was really striking that many politicians around the world abdicated their responsibility and just pointed to the experts, said, "What should we do?"
Yeah, I must say that you are using exactly my words. I had a lot of debates with the epidemiologists, and I don't know how to put them together, those people, and they simply don't want to accept for us absolutely fundamental term trade-off. For them, the term trade-off is not understandable, or they don't pretend that they don't understand this point. So when I talk in my writings about trade-offs, they immediately, and I'm sure you know the same, start attacking me for being quite happy with the fact that many people die, and so this is a standard debate. I follow the discussions in your country as well. By the way, I am in good contact with one of the places where you made an important interview. I am a good friend of Hillsdale College, and I have visited that college many times. So I remember your article published in Imprimis. This is the same debate for me, really.
Yeah, I mean, it's not unique to the United States. Obviously, the same debate has happened elsewhere. But it also, I mean, it struck me. I completely agree with you. This idea, in fact, it was seen as immoral to say that in March of 2020 that there is a trade-off at all, right? So if you compare the life of a child who's denied schooling, that they're going to live a shorter, poorer, less healthy life. I mean, that's what the economic literature shows, versus the life of an older person from COVID. I mean, that's assuming that the restrictions actually save the life of the older person. Actually, I don't believe that that's true. But that's a legitimate question to ask from a social policy point of view. How do we manage those trade-offs? If we close schools down in order to save older people? I mean, that's a very sharp trade-off, and that's worth having a discussion around. Yet it was immoral to even bring up the possibility that there may be some collateral damage from the extraordinary measures that we underwent.
Well, those people on the other side of the barricade are talking permanently about moral and immoral. I think it's not the issue. The issue is really trying to solve a difficult trade-off, which is not easy, and we don't pretend it's easy. And of course, we want to minimize the number of deaths in society, your society, my society. But at the same time, we don't want to avoid simply killing normal life in our countries, killing the economy, making terrible mistakes in public policy. I used to be Minister of Finance, destroying state budgets all over the world. And after the fall of communism, I was the first Minister of Finance in a post-communist government. And I remember that my strategy was, now for the first time we will have a balanced budget, and it was connected with my name for every child in our society, that I am cutting expenditures, that I don't want to give them one benefit or another. That was the game after the fall of communism, and we succeeded in winning it. And it's a tragedy that no one is playing the same game as we used to play at that moment. It was a unique situation. The people understood that something happened absolutely fundamental, that we have to start anew. And I think I succeeded in fighting for such a rational trade-offs, to put it that way.
So President Klaus, I think it's interesting when you talk, because, and I've seen it in your interviews and your writing, the vision of society that you have is a very plural vision. Many people with different aims, goals, sometimes in conflict, many times in cooperation. And yet when we think about COVID policy, it's focused on a single goal: infection control. Mm-hmm. So I think I have my opinions on this and thoughts on this, but I would love to hear how you think a society that's focused on a single goal, how healthy that society can be relative to society that focuses on plural. I mean, I think you bring up your experience with the communists. Yeah. I mean, it seemed to be similar there as well. There was a 5-year plan, a single goal. And so there are some pathologies in common with COVID policy and sort of communist policy.
You know, in our situation, I spent still more than half of my life in the communist era. It stopped more than 30 years ago. Nevertheless, communism was not just a loss of time. We learned a lot. At least some of us who wanted to introduce some social issues and the functioning of society, I think we learned a lot. And this is an experience which you people in the United States don't, or Western Europe don't have. So we therefore had to fight for pluralism, for the acceptance of different views, for trying to find social mechanisms how to solve that issue. Before making this interview, I had a speech with one of the business groups in this country, and they asked me about how to create a vision for our society. This is missing, asked one of the men. And I said, sorry, I don't think there is any vision missing. We live in a society with conflicting views, with different positions, with different stances, and the role of society is to put them together and to find an acceptable solution. No one vision. I must say that majority of the people in the hall in a Marriott hotel here in downtown Prague, looked at me somehow a little bit surprised, because it's a moral issue to say that I am for visions. And yes and no. I accept that the people have individual visions, and to force them to forget their visions and to accept another one is unacceptable. And our communist experience gave us something very important in this respect.
Yeah, I mean, that struck me too as well. The vision of almost all of Western society, actually much of the world society now, is infection control. The fear of COVID and control of COVID is a single goal. It's not that the goal is not worthy. It's that it lives in the same world where so many other things are important: preventing childhood hunger, or educating our children, keeping our older people so that they can interact with their family members. I mean, many goals people have, too many to count, and yet infection control is now the only goal that's permitted. It struck me.
Infection control is one thing, and there is another simplification. The Western society, and I'm afraid that the medical profession is partly, importantly, guilty in this respect. The Western society accepts that the infection control means vaccination. I have been, as a non-medical doctor, I have all the time protested against trying to find a vaccine instead of trying to find a normal medical ways of solving a disease, but no one is fighting COVID. Everyone is fighting in a crazy way SARS-CoV-2, which is a totally different story, if I understand it correctly.
Yeah, so the virus, of course, SARS-CoV-2 causes the disease COVID. It is interesting. The vaccine came very, very quickly, but there's been much less effort on treatment. There have been some advances, but not nearly so much effort as in the vaccines. Actually, let's talk a little about the vaccines, and in particular about vaccine passports and vaccine mandates. The vaccines, as you know, for COVID, there's a sharp age gradient in the risk. Older people face a much greater risk than younger people from the disease. And children, for instance, have more risk from the flu than they do from COVID. Yes.
8 months ago, but I'm not afraid.
Yeah, well, I mean, fear and risk are two different things. I mean, people can manage risk. But I think it's interesting. People have argued for the vaccine mandates and the vaccine passports essentially as a way to reduce the risk that older people face. So if young people get vaccinated, well, then they're less likely to pass the disease on to older people. Now, it turns out that hasn't really played out. Many countries that are widely vaccinated, you still can spread the disease despite being vaccinated. This vaccine is not perfect. So in that context, the vaccine mandates strike me as coercive without actually producing a public health benefit. It may produce a private benefit because it protects against severe disease, but not a public benefit. And of course, as an economist, you know about externalities. Can you talk about the role that those kinds of coercive policies should or shouldn't play when we have something like this vaccine?
Professor, you are absolutely right. But as I used to be an academician, but as someone who spent almost 3 decades in politics, I must say that it's too sophisticated in having a chance in 30 minutes answer on TV to explain the difference between private and public benefit. It's difficult, and I must admit that we all of us didn't succeed in explaining it to the people, and therefore they don't understand it. That's beyond their way of comprehension, beyond their way of thinking. So in our debates, in our discussion in my country is currently, I hope no authorities are controlling this interview. No, I'm joking. Friends of mine came from Germany and Austria last weekend. They were absolutely shocked to be in Prague. And they say Prague is an oasis, an island of freedom. No masks and no controls when you enter a restaurant or nothing. So I think we are now in a relatively good shape. I'm afraid it can change overnight. But the debate in our country is now these days about obligatory mandated vaccines or voluntary vaccines. That's the debate of the day. And I think a lot of people is protesting against the mandated vaccines. So I think the fight is not over yet. So we still hopefully will do something.
I mean, the United States, we're having a very similar fight over the mandated vaccines, but also something I think you have not had in the Czech Republic, which is closure of schools and the masking of children down to age 2. So it seems like a uniquely American, strange to say, but uniquely American kind of debate.
I'm sorry, Professor. We used to have the same closure of.
You had to close schools. So, I'm sorry to hear that.
So I have an experience with my grandchildren, and so we all know something about it. I don't think that we started at the age of 2, as you mentioned, but the situation has been crazy in this country as well.
So can let's explore that just a little bit, because that's also worth trying to understand. Why is it that so many countries adopted the same policy almost overnight? It didn't seem like there was direct coordination between the countries, but yet every country many countries adopted this suite of policies. Essentially, China locked down in February or January of 2020 around Wuhan. There was the situation in Italy that seemed out of control, and then immediately, almost with a snap of a finger, everybody went from the normal pandemic plan, which would say let's protect the vulnerable, but let society work as normal as possible, while giving people tools to protect themselves if they can, and especially protecting the vulnerable. Right? That's the normal pandemic plan. It's how we dealt with pandemics in the past. And yet every country overnight adopted this policy of lockdown. How do you explain that? I mean, it's especially since there wasn't like a big international conference or treaty.
So first, thank you for mentioning that point. I try to argue the same way. No coordination. Some people don't like to hear it because they have no other explanation for the fact that the same closing of schools in California and here in Prague or elsewhere. I agree fully that there was no coordination. There was, however, the lack of courage of politicians, the feeling that they will lose everything when they don't do the same as in a country next door. So this is the tragic cascade of behavior all over the world, and especially in a small continent as Europe, where really to go to a different country from Prague, to go to Poland to the north, and Germany to the west, and Austria to the south, and Slovakia to the east is 2 hours drive or something like that. So cascade of behavior patterns, lack of courage, and politicians were afraid of being responsible for unnecessary deaths, and this is
So that's why they went to experts and said, okay, you tell us what to do, and that way they offload the risk of being wrong to the expert. because they're following the science, if you will.
We have to accept some sort of risk, that there is a non-zero risk is a basic feature of human society. But I'm sure you use the same arguments in your debates every day with other people. The debates are, which is irony of history, the debates are identical. Probably
Yes.
in Stanford and in Prague.
All right, so we're nearing up on half hour, and I promised to not spend so much time, but I would very curious to know your thoughts on what reforms can we make so that if another disease like this should ever stalk the earth, that politicians don't overreact, that experts have the proper place in the debate, that governments don't adopt policies designed to panic the population. I mean, these seem like all extraordinary things that there've been governments have done that in the past, but we've seen we've generally thought about that as outside of the realm of what governments ought to do. A good government would seek to reassure the public as best they can, protect the vulnerable. What reforms can we put in place, if any? What structures can we change so that this kind of overreaction doesn't happen again, and so that we deal with future pandemics as one among many things that people should care about, as opposed to the only thing?
Well, first, overreaction of governments. In my understanding, the overreaction comes from the weakness of most of the governments. In my country, in your country as well. You have before elections. We have before elections. They don't want to make a mistake, so they react when it is easy, and when they can make decision by decrees instead of sophisticated techniques. So they simply announce a lockdown, and they are in a good position in the country. So the governments are in the current vulnerable, weak society. The governments are not strong enough to be able to make courageous decisions, and there are no such politicians able to do it. But as an economist, I think that it's not. The problem is not on the supply side. The problem is on the demand side. There is no real demand from society to behave differently. It doesn't mean that the people are happy and that the people are not criticizing the governments, but there is a big difference, huge difference between criticism and dissatisfaction with the government and a real political stance which asks for something else. And this is missing here, at least in our
sense. The way you talk about it, it's almost it's a cultural defect, not simply a political defect.
Yeah.
So the culture that thinks that there should be free speech and free debate, a culture that thinks that there's this pluralistic vision we've been discussing.
Yeah.
It would never produce a political response the way we've seen. Right? Is that's what you're arguing?
Yeah.
How do we reform that?
I agree.
How do we get back that?
I don't like very much to call it cultural, but it is cultural in a very broad sense. We would need a different term, but we don't have it. Therefore, we speak about cultural, but I still have the feeling that it's not exactly what we are talking about. But it's definitely much more than a political issue. This is the whole society, social. In a broader sense.
So, do you think? Are you optimistic about the future? Is there hope, or are you? Where do you see what happens in the next pandemic? Will we do the same thing?
No, I remember 25 years ago, I made a big speech in Vienna, Austria, And the famous German old man economist was asked to make after the speech laudatio. And I had a feeling that it was 5 years after the fall of communism. I had a feeling that I'm talking optimistically and everything is, we are moving ahead. And that man, a famous German economist, said that he heard some pessimistic tones in my speech, and he mentioned the German proverb, Optimismus ist Pflicht, which in English means optimism is an obligation, is necessary. I'm using that term quite often. So on the one hand, optimismus is Pflicht. Optimism is an obligation for us, but naivety is not. And I think we have in the current world we have to fight more naivety than pessimism. So I think it's not so easy. I don't know what to do. I started with saying that I feel not very healthy society around me. And this is something totally different from what we expected 30 years ago in the moment of the fall of communism. We had a feeling that everything is open, everything is okay. We are free to do what we want. Now, I'm afraid we are not so much.
Well, on that note, we'll end. Thank you, President Klaus. I really am honored to be able to speak with you, and I've learned a lot from discussing these issues with you.
Thank you very much for a very fine, nice discussion.